I spent the past 6 months creating the perfect New York style pizza recipe. I mean, I study this pizza harder than most people study for finals. And after countless hours and what feels like hundreds of tests, I can confidently say this is the most authentic New York style pizza recipe designed for home cooks. I mean, probably. And by the end of this video, you'll know how to make it. And it all starts with the crust, which to me is defined by 4 main things: thinness, chew, crispness, and charring. So nearly every single pizzeria in New York is gonna be using high gluten flour. This is what gives the pizza its signature chew, so you're really just not gonna achieve the right results without it. So personally, I use King Arthur high gluten flour. It's easy to find online, at least if you're in the US, although it is a bit more expensive than your typical flour. So another alternative would be to use normal bread flour and then add some vital wheat gluten to increase the protein content. Now, some of the best pizzerias I tried in New York also include a small amount of sifted, freshly milled flour for extra flavor, somewhere around 10% of the total flour. So if you don't have access to freshly milled flour, the best alternative would be to use either spelt or rye flour. And again, you should sift it to remove the excess bran, because that bran would otherwise inhibit gluten development and reduce the chewiness of the final crust. Personally, I like to sift a big batch ahead of time and keep it in my cabinet for easy access. And by the way, you can find the complete recipe in the description below, but to make it more customizable, I also made up a dough calculator spreadsheet. Basically, you can enter the size pizza you want to make, how many you want to make, and a few other things we'll discuss later, and it'll calculate a recipe for you. And there's also an area where you can figure out how much vital wheat gluten you need to add to your flour if that's the route you're taking. So the spreadsheet is free to use, you can check it out in the description below. But anyways, now that the flour is taken care of, let's talk water, aka hydration. Basically, the higher the hydration, the airier your crust will be, but also the less crispy and structured it'll be. So I found that a 65% hydration, or 65 grams of water per 100 grams of flour, is the perfect middle ground. It's low enough that the dough doesn't become sticky and hard to work with, but high enough that the final crust ends up both airy and crisp. But since everyone has different preferences, I've listed a few different dough styles on the spreadsheet, and based on which one you choose, the hydration level will be adjusted accordingly. But anyways, after mixing the flour and water, we're gonna let the dough rest, aka autolyse, for about 20 minutes. This lets the flour hydrate and start forming gluten before we add any other ingredients. And before you think, psh, I can just skip that step, let me show you the difference it makes. Here you can see the dough before the autolyse versus after, and whenever I made the dough without this step, it turned out significantly less chewy. But after the dough rests, we can add the dry ingredients, starting with the yeast. I use a relatively small amount, just about 0.5% as a baker's percentage, which I explained in episode 2 of this series, but that basically just means 0.5 grams of yeast for every 100 grams of flour. And the reason I use so little is because this allows the dough to rise slower and therefore to develop more flavor as it ferments. But now I'll add my salt in a baker's percentage of 3% and my sugar in a baker's percentage of 1.5%. The sugar is going to help the crust to brown more quickly, which is especially helpful in a home oven that doesn't get as hot as a commercial pizza oven does. Now, after giving everything a mix and a few kneads on my table, I'll let the dough rest again for about 20 more minutes. This is going to let the gluten relax, which in turn will make the dough much easier to knead. And when we come back, we'll just knead for about 5 minutes. If the dough gets too sticky at any point, let it rest for about a minute or two, and by the time you come back, it'll be much easier to work with. Now, after kneading, I'll let the dough rest for a few more minutes before forming it into a nice taut ball, and then throwing it back into my covered bowl to rise. We're looking for it to double or triple in size here, which should take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours depending on the temperature of your environment. Then from there, we'll divide the dough into the desired number of pieces. In my case here, I'm making 2 14-inch pizzas. And of course, you should weigh out the pieces to make sure they're exactly the right size. Then form each one into a very taut ball. And this is important because this is what will keep the dough strong as it rises and allow it to stay circular when we eventually form it out into a pizza. Then from here, we'll just put them into containers to rise. So I usually use either these metal cake pans or these bowl plate thingies I have, but just use whatever you have. A 9x13 pan or even a normal plate works fine. You just don't want to use a container that's too narrow because that'll mess up the shape of the dough that we work so hard to create. But next, we'll throw them into the fridge to ferment for another 2 to 3 days. Technically, you could use this dough the same day, but the longer you let it ferment, the more flavorful it'll be. After too long though, the dough becomes weak and deflated, so I found about 2 to 3 days to be the sweet spot. Now in the meantime, let's talk sauce. And the most important consideration here is which brand of tomatoes you use. So canned tomatoes are a given for New York style pizza, but not all brands have the right flavor profile. The best I've found are these red pack crushed tomatoes. However, this version only comes in these massive number 10 cans, which is a lot of tomatoes. Perfect for those quiet nights at home when you want to bake 20 to 30 pizzas, but for the average day, not so much. Of course, you can freeze the sauce, but that's still a lot to keep in your freezer. Now, Red Pack also makes a retail 28-ounce can, but they're not nearly as good. The best retail brand I found is these Cento all-in-ones. Not the normal crushed Centos. They have to be the all-in-ones. So you can buy them online from Cento, but with shipping they're pretty expensive. expensive, so I actually buy mine from a site called Imperfect Foods. This isn't sponsored though, that's just genuinely where I buy most of my produce from. I do have a discount link in the description below though if you're interested in signing up. Otherwise, Bianco de Napoli whole peeled tomatoes are also pretty good, and they're readily available at Whole Foods and on Amazon. But now for the recipe itself, New York style sauce is very basic. It's not cooked, and the only ingredients are tomatoes, salt, oregano, and sometimes sugar. The last of which I do personally like to add because it helps balance out the acidity of the tomatoes. But the other main thing to consider is the sauce consistency. The commercial red packs are a bit too thick straight out of the can, so what I do is dilute them by about 25%. That's 26 ounces of water per number 10 can. But when I'm using any other brand, I don't dilute them. What I do though, regardless of the brand, is blend the tomatoes. I found that milling removes too much of the tomato pulp, and leaving the sauce unprocessed leaves me with too many big chunks of tomatoes. And if you use an immersion blender, you can make the sauce straight inside a container for easy storage in the fridge. But now with our sauce and dough prepared, let's talk baking. A typical New York pizzeria is going to be baking at a minimum of 550 degrees Fahrenheit or 287.77777 degrees Celsius. But the best spots I visited bake even higher, usually between 620 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So this means at home we should bake at our oven's highest possible temperature, which is typically going to be 550 degrees Fahrenheit. But since that's still lower than we would ideally want, we need to make one more adjustment, and that is to bake on steel rather than stone. Steel retains heat better than stone, and it also transfers heat much more quickly, which is going to help to crisp up the bottom of the pizza. So the brand I use is Baking Steel, and this one in particular is the Baking Steel Pro. It's great because it's 3/8 of an inch thick, so it retains plenty of heat, and it's also 16 inches by 16 inches, which means that I can bake a 16-inch pizza, which I think is important given that one of the defining characteristics of a New York style pizza is its size. So again, this isn't sponsored, it's just a product that I genuinely use and enjoy. But I was able to get a discount code for anyone watching my videos. So if you use the code Charlie10 at checkout, you can get 10% off your order. I'll leave that link in the description below. But anyways, when I'm getting ready to bake, I'll place my steel onto the second highest rack of my oven. Then I'll set the oven to 550 degrees Fahrenheit and let it preheat for at least an hour, but preferably up to 90 minutes. And at the same time, I'll take my dough out of the fridge to let it come up to room temperature and to rise just a bit more. Then once the oven is preheated, we can shape and top the pizza. So here we'll be making a classic cheese slice. And when it comes to cheese, there's really only one obvious choice: low moisture mozzarella. Preferably whole milk low moisture mozzarella because it's going to have a much better flavor and texture than the part skim stuff. Unfortunately though, it's not too easy to find whole milk low moisture mozzarella, let alone a high quality one. The gold standard for New York pizzerias though is a brand called Grande. It's only available at food service stores, but if you can find some of it, you should use it. What really separates the good cheese from the bad is the meltability. It should melt super nicely without separating too much, and it should stay rich and gooey on top of the pizza. Now since mozzarella is pretty mild tasting, it's also traditional to add some grated pecorino romano for extra saltiness and tang. But now when we're ready to bake, I'll start by getting everything lined up. My dough, sauce, pecorino, and mozzarella. And then I've also got my wooden pizza peel, which I'm going to use to slide the pizza off into the oven. And I've got my 2 flour shakers for dusting, one all-purpose and one semola. So I'll start by sprinkling some of the semola flour onto my pizza peel and onto my work surface. Then I'll dust the dough with a generous amount of all-purpose flour, bring it out onto my surface, and then dust it again with the all-purpose flour. Now working from the center outward, press the dough down, being sure to leave a thicker portion at the edge to form the crust. Then spread it out on the counter like so, trying to keep it as round as possible. And this is where all of that flour that we added to the surface comes in handy. And from here on, you want to avoid stretching out the middle any further, so be sure to only stretch around the edges. Next, toss the dough back and forth from arm to arm to both knock off the flour and to continue stretching it out. Then finally continue stretching it with your fists like so, rotating and stretching until the dough reaches the proper size. You want to keep the dough moving as quickly as possible to prevent any uneven spots, which will take some practice, and I'm still not an expert by any means, but you'll get better as you do it more. Then just place the dough out onto your peel, and if it's still not big enough, continue stretching until it is. So we'll start with our sauce, pouring in the center and then swirling outward to create an even distribution. Then hit it with optionally a bit more oregano, then pecorino, and then mozzarella. And you want to avoid adding too much sauce or cheese in the center because that can lead to a soggy pizza. Now the amounts of each ingredient you use will depend on what size pizza you're making and on your preferences. So on the spreadsheet there are several options to choose from. Here I'm making a 16-inch pizza with medium sauce and medium cheese, although I usually prefer to make the version with light cheese. And I think it goes without saying that you can add whatever toppings you like at this point too. Now I'll just give the dough a little shimmy to make sure it's not going to stick when I slide it off, which the wooden pizza peel really helps to prevent, but if you have a baking tray big enough or even just a piece of cardboard, you can use that instead. Now I'll carefully slide this pizza off onto my hot steel and bake it for about 4 to 5 minutes. And I like to rotate the pizza halfway through to make sure it browns evenly. You'll know it's ready to take out when the cheese is nicely melted together and it's just started to separate. But we're not done yet, because if you've ever gotten pizza by the slice, you know that it's generally reheated to order, meaning that it was baked and then cooled and then heated again before serving, which has a big impact on the crust. Specifically, it helps us to get that solid crispness and structure that we're looking for. So after letting the pizza cool for 15 to 20 minutes, I'll cut a slice and then throw it back onto my steel with the oven's still set to 550 degrees. And I also like to turn on the broiler to get the top of the slice nice and browned as well. And after about 60 to 90 seconds, when the slice is charred to my liking, it's ready to serve. And that, my friends, is an authentic New York slice at home. It's got the perfect chew, perfect crunch, nice charring on the bottom. The sauce is tangy but also sweet. Really, this is my ideal New York slice. Now, if you haven't seen the previous episodes of the series that led up to this slice, you can check those out right here. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.